Chapters 23 through 26 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. Translated by John Addington Symonds. Chapters 23 through 26. 23. While I was pushing forward Salamanca's vase, I had only one little boy as help, whom I had taken at the entreaty of friends, and half against my own will, to be my workman. He was about 14 years of age, bore the name of Paulino, and was son to a Roman burgess, who lived upon the income of his property. Paulino was the best mannered, the most honest, and the most beautiful boy I ever saw in my whole life. His modest ways and actions, together with his superlative beauty, and his devotion to myself, bred in me as great an affection for him as a man's breast can hold. This passionate love led me oftentimes to delight the lad with music, for I observed that his marvellous features, which by complexion wore a tone of modest melancholy, brightened up, and when I took my cornet, broke into a smile so lovely and so sweet that I do not marvel at the silly stories which the Greeks have written about the deities of heaven. Indeed, if my boy had lived in those times, he would probably have turned their heads still more. He had a sister, named Faustina, more beautiful, I verily believe, than that Faustina about whom the old books gossip so. Sometimes he took me to their vineyard, and, so far as I could judge, it struck me that Paulino's good father would have welcomed me as a son-in-law. This affair led me to play more than I was used to do. It happened at that time that one Jacomo of Cesena, a musician in the Pope's band and a very excellent performer, sent word through Lorenzo, the trumpeter of Lucca, who is now in our Duke's service, to inquire whether I was inclined to help them at the Pope's Ferragosto, playing soprano with my cornet in some motets of great beauty selected by them for that occasion. Although I had the greatest desire to finish the vase I had begun, yet, since music has a wondrous charm of its own, and also because I wished to please my old father, I consented to join them. During 8 days before the festival we practised 2 hours a day together. Then on the 1st of August we went to the Belvedere, and while Pope Clement was at table, we played those carefully studied motets so well that His Holiness protested he had never heard music more sweetly executed or with better harmony of parts. He sent for Jacomo and asked him where and how he had procured so excellent a cornet for soprano, and inquired particularly who I was. Jacomo told him my name in full, whereupon the Pope said, "So then, he is a son of Maestro Giovanni." On being assured I was, the Pope expressed his wish to have me in his service with the other bandsmen. Jacomo replied, "Most blessed Father, I cannot pretend for certain that you will get him, for his profession, to which he devotes himself assiduously, is that of a goldsmith, and he works in it miraculously well, and earns by it far more than he could do by playing." To this the Pope added, "I am the better inclined to him now that I find him possessor of a talent more than I expected. See that he obtains the same salary as the rest of you, and tell him from me to join my service, and that I will find work enough by the day for him to do in his other trade." Then stretching out his hand, he gave him 100 golden crowns of the camera in a handkerchief, and said, "Divide these so that he may take his share." When Jacomo left the Pope, he came to us, and related in detail all that the Pope had said, and after dividing the money between the 8 of us, and giving me my share, he said to me, "Now I am going to have you inscribed among our company." I replied, "Let the day pass; tomorrow I will give my answer." When I left them, I went meditating whether I ought to accept the invitation, inasmuch as I could not but suffer if I abandoned the noble studies of my art. The following night my father appeared to me in a dream, and begged me with tears of tenderest affection, for God's love and his, to enter upon this engagement. Methought I answered that nothing would induce me to do so, In an instant he assumed so horrible an aspect as to frighten me out of my wits, and cried, "If you do not, you will have a father's curse, but if you do, may you be ever blessed by me." When I woke, I ran, for very fright, to have myself inscribed. Then I wrote to my old father, telling him the news, which so affected him with extreme joy that a sudden fit of illness took him and well nigh brought him to death's door. In his answer to my letter he told me that he too had dreamed nearly the same as I had. 24. Knowing now that I had gratified my father's honest wish, I began to think that everything would prosper with me to a glorious and honourable end. Accordingly I set myself with indefatigable industry to the completion of the vase I had begun for Salamanca. That prelate was a very extraordinary man, extremely rich, but difficult to please. He sent daily to learn what I was doing, and when his messenger did not find me at home, he broke into fury, saying that he would take the work out of my hands and give it to others to finish. This came of my slavery to that accursed music. Still I laboured diligently night and day, until, when I had brought my work to a point when it could be exhibited, I submitted it to the inspection of the bishop. This so increased his desire to see it finished that I was sorry I had shown it. At the end of 3 months I had it ready, with little animals and foliage and masks as beautiful as one could hope to see. No sooner was it done than I sent it by the hand of my workman Paulino to show that able artist Lucagnolo, of whom I have spoken above. Paulino, with the grace and beauty which belonged to him, spoke as follows: "Messer Lucagnolo, Benvenuto bids me say that he is sent to show you his promises and your lumber, expecting in return to see from you his gewgaws." This message given, Lucagnolo took up the vase and carefully examined it. Then he said to Paulino: "Fair boy, tell your master that he is a great and able artist, and that I beg him to be willing to have me for a friend, and not to engage in aught else." The mission of that virtuous and marvellous lad caused me the greatest joy, and then the vase was carried to Salamanca, who ordered it to be valued. Lucagnolo took part in the valuation, estimating and praising it far above my own opinion. Salamanca, lifting up the vase, cried like a true Spaniard: "I swear by God that I will take as long in paying him as he has lagged in making it." When I heard this, I was exceedingly put out, and fell to cursing all Spain and every one who wished well to it. Amongst other beautiful ornaments, this vase had a handle, made all of one piece, with most delicate mechanism, which, when a spring was touched, stood upright above the mouth of it. While the prelate was one day ostentatiously exhibiting my vase to certain Spanish gentlemen of his suite, it chanced that one of them, upon Monsignor's quitting the room, began roughly to work the handle, and as the gentle spring which moved it could not bear his loutish violence, it broke in his hand. Aware what mischief he had done, he begged the butler who had charge of the bishop's plate to take it to the master who had made it, for him to mend, and promised to pay what price he asked, provided it was set to rights at once. So the vase came once more into my hands, and I promised to put it forthwith in order, which indeed I did. It was brought to me before dinner, and at 22 o'clock the man who brought it returned, all in a sweat, for he had run the whole way, Monsignor having again asked for it to show to certain other gentlemen. The butler then, without giving me time to utter a word, cried: "Quick, quick, bring the vase!" I, who wanted to act at leisure, and not to give up to him, said that I did not mean to be so quick. The serving man got into such a rage that he made as though he would put one hand to his sword, while with the other he threatened to break the shop open. To this I put a stop at once with my own weapon, using therewith spirited language, and saying: "I am not going to give it to you. Go and tell Monsignor, your master, that I want the money for my work before I let it leave this shop." When the fellow saw he could not obtain it by swaggering, he fell to praying me, as one prays to the cross, declaring that if I would only give it up, he would take care I should be paid. These words did not make me swerve from my purpose, but I kept on saying the same thing. At last, despairing of success, he swore to come with Spaniards enough to cut me in pieces. Then he took to his heels, while I, who inclined to believe partly in their murderous attack, resolved that I would defend myself with courage. So I got an admirable little gun ready, which I used for shooting game, and muttered to myself, "He who robs me of my property and labour may take my life too, and welcome." While I was carrying on this debate in my own mind, a crowd of Spaniards arrived, led by the major domo, who with the headstrong rashness of his race bade them go in and take the vase and give me a good beating. Hearing these words, I showed them the muzzle of my gun, and prepared to fire, and cried in a loud voice, "Renegade Jews! Traitors! Is it thus that one breaks into houses and shops in our city of Rome? Come as many of you thieves as like, an inch nearer to this wicket, and I'll blow all their brains out with my gun." Then I turned the muzzle toward their major domo, and making as though I would discharge it, called out, "And you, big thief, who are egging them on, I mean to kill you first." He clapped spurs to the jennet he was riding, and took flight headlong. The commotion we were making stirred up all the neighbours, who came crowding round, together with some Roman gentlemen who chanced to pass, and cried, "Do but kill the renegades, and we will stand by you." These words had the effect of frightening the Spaniards in good earnest. They withdrew, and were compelled by the circumstances to relate the whole affair to Monsignor. Being a man of inordinate haughtiness, he rated the members of his household, both because they had engaged in such an act of violence, and also because, having begun, they had not gone through with it. At this juncture, the painter, who had been concerned in the whole matter, came in, and the bishop bade him go and tell me that if I did not bring the vase at once, he would make mincemeat of me, but if I brought it, he would pay its price down. These threats were so far from terrifying me that I sent him word I was going immediately to lay my case before the Pope. In the meantime, his anger and my fear subsided; whereupon, being guaranteed by some Roman noblemen of high degree that the prelate would not harm me, and having assurance that I should be paid, I armed myself with a large poniard and my good coat of mail, and betook myself to his palace, where he had drawn up all his household. I entered, and Paulino followed with the silver vase. It was just like passing through the zodiac, neither more nor less, for one of them had the face of the lion, another of the scorpion, a third of the crab. However, we passed onward to the presence of the rascally priest, who spouted out a torrent of such language as only priests and Spaniards have at their command. In return, I never raised my eyes to look at him, nor answered word for word. That seemed to augment the fury of his anger, and causing paper to be put before me, he commanded me to write an acknowledgment to the effect that I had been amply satisfied and paid in full. Then I raised my head, and said I should be very glad to do so when I had received the money. The bishop's rage continued to rise, threats and recriminations were flung about, but at last the money was paid, and I wrote the receipt. Then I departed, glad at heart and in high spirits. 25. When Pope Clement heard the story, he had seen the vase before, but it was not shown him as my work. He expressed much pleasure and spoke warmly in my praise, publicly saying that he felt very favourably toward me. This caused Monsignor Salamanca to repent that he had hectored over me, and in order to make up our quarrel, he sent the same painter to inform me that he meant to give me large commissions. I replied that I was willing to undertake them, but that I should require to be paid in advance. This speech too came to Pope Clement's ears, and made him laugh heartily. Cardinal Cibo was in the presence, and the Pope narrated to him the whole history of my dispute with the bishop. Then he turned to one of his people, and ordered him to go on supplying me with work for the palace. Cardinal Cibo sent for me, and after some time spent in agreeable conversation, gave me the order for a large vase, bigger than Salamanca's. I likewise obtained commissions from Cardinal Cornaro, and many others of the Holy College, especially Ridolfi and Salviati. They all kept me well employed, so that I earned plenty of money. Madonna Porzia now advised me to open a shop on my own. This I did, and I never stopped working for that excellent and gentle lady, who paid me exceedingly well, and by whose means perhaps it was that I came to make a figure in the world. I contracted close friendship with Signor Gabriello Cesarino, at that time Gonfalonier of Rome, and executed many pieces for him. One among the rest is worthy of mention. It was a large golden medal to wear in the hat. I engraved upon it Leda with her swan, and being very well pleased with the workmanship, he said he should like to have it valued, in order that I might be properly paid. Now, since the medal was executed with consummate skill, the valuers of the trade set a far higher price on it than he had thought of. I therefore kept the medal, and got nothing for my pains. The same sort of adventures happened in this case as in that of Salamanca's vase. But I shall pass such matters briefly by, lest they hinder me from telling things of greater importance. 26. Since I am writing my life, I must from time to time diverge from my profession, in order to describe with brevity, if not in detail, some incidents which have no bearing on my career as artist. On the morning of St. John's Day I happened to be dining with several men of our nation, painters, sculptors, goldsmiths, amongst the most notable of whom was Rosso and Gianfrancesco, the pupil of Raffaello. I had invited them without restraint or ceremony to the place of our meeting, and they were all laughing and joking, as is natural when a crowd of men come together to make merry on so great a festival. It chanced that a light-brained, swaggering young fellow passed by. He was a soldier of Rienzo da Cherry, who, when he heard the noise that we were making, gave vent to a string of opprobrious sarcasms upon the folk of Florence. I, who was the host of those great artists and men of worth, taking the insult to myself, slipped out quietly without being observed, and went up to him. I ought to say that he had a punk of his there, and was going on with his stupid ribaldries to amuse her. When I met him, I asked if he was the rash fellow who was speaking evil of the Florentines. He answered at once, "I am that man." On this I raised my hand, struck him in the face, and said, "And I am this man." Then we each of us drew our swords with spirit, but the fray had hardly begun, when a crowd of persons intervened, who rather took my part than not, hearing and seeing that I was in the right. On the following day, a challenge to fight with him was brought me, which I accepted very gladly, saying that I expected to complete this job far quicker than those of the other art I practised. So I went at once to confer with a fine old man called Bevilacqua, who was reputed to have been the first sword of Italy, because he had fought more than 20 serious duels, and had always come off with honour. This excellent man was a great friend of mine. He knew me as an artist, and had also been concerned as intermediary in certain ugly quarrels between me and others. Accordingly, when he had learned my business, he answered with a smile, "My Benvenuto, if you had an affair with Mars, I'm sure you would come out with honour, because through all the years that I have known you, I have never seen you wrongfully take up a quarrel." So he consented to be my second, and we repaired with sword in hand to the appointed place, but no blood was shed, for my opponent made the matter up, and I came with much credit out of the affair. I will not add further particulars, for though they would be very interesting in their own way, I wish to keep both space and words for my art, which has been my chief inducement to write as I am doing, and about which I shall have only too much to say. The spirit of honourable rivalry impelled me to attempt some other masterpiece, which should equal, or even surpass, the productions of that able craftsman Lucagnolo, whom I have mentioned. Still I did not on this account neglect my own fine art of jewellery, and so both the one and the other wrought me much profit and more credit, and in both of them I continued to produce things of marked originality. There was at that time in Rome a very able artist of Perugia, named Lautizio, who worked only in one department, where he was sole and unrivalled throughout the world. You must know that at Rome every cardinal has a seal, upon which his title is engraved, and these seals are made just as large as a child's hand of about 12 years of age, and, as I have already said, the cardinal's title is engraved upon the seal together with a great many ornamental figures. A well-made article of the kind fetches 100 or more than 100 crowns. This excellent workman, like Lucagnolo, roused in me some honest rivalry, although the art he practised is far remote from the other branches of goldsmithery, and consequently Lautizio was not skilled in making anything but seals. I gave my mind to acquiring his craft also, although I found it very difficult, and, unrepelled by the trouble which it gave me, I went on zealously upon the path of profit and improvement. There was in Rome another most excellent craftsman of ability, who was a Milanese named Messer Caradosso. He dealt in nothing but little chiselled medals, made of plates of metal and such like things. I have seen of his some Paxes in half relief, and some Christs a palm in length wrought of the thinnest golden plates, so exquisitely done that I esteemed him the greatest master in that kind I had ever seen, and envied him more than all the rest together. There were also other masters who worked at medals carved in steel, which may be called the models and true guides for those who aim at striking coins in the most perfect style. All these diverse arts I set myself with unflagging industry to learn. I must not omit the exquisite art of enamelling, in which I have never known any one excel save a Florentine, our countryman, called Amerigo. I did not know him, but was well acquainted with his incomparable masterpieces. Nothing in any part of the world or by craftsmen that I have seen approached the divine beauty of their workmanship. To this branch too I devoted myself with all my strength, although it is extremely difficult, chiefly because of the fire, which, after long time and trouble spent in other processes, has to be applied at last, and not unfrequently brings the whole to ruin. In spite of its great difficulties, it gave me so much pleasure that I looked upon them as recreation, and this came from the special gift which the God of nature bestowed on me, that is to say, a temperament so happy and of such excellent parts that I was freely able to accomplish whatever it pleased me to take in hand. The various departments of art which I have described are very different one from the other, so that a man who excels in one of them, if he undertakes the others, hardly ever achieves the same success, whereas I strove with all my power to become equally versed in all of them, and in the proper place I shall demonstrate that I attained my object. End of chapters 23 through 26. Through 30 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andrew Coleman. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. Translated by John Addington Symonds. Chapters 27 through 30. 27. At that time, while I was still a young man of about 23, there raged a plague of such extraordinary violence that many thousands died of it every day in Rome. Somewhat terrified at this calamity, I began to take certain amusements, as my mind suggested, and for a reason which I will presently relate. I had formed a habit of going on feast days to the ancient buildings, and copying parts of them in wax or with the pencil, and since these buildings are all ruins, and the ruins house innumerable pigeons, it came into my head to use my gun against these birds. So then, avoiding all commerce with people, in my terror of the plague, I used to put a fowling piece on my boy Paolino's shoulder, and he and I went out alone into the ruins, and oftentimes we came home laden with a cargo of the fattest pigeons. I did not care to charge my gun with more than a single ball, and thus it was by pure skill in the art that I filled such heavy bags. I had a fowling piece which I had made myself. Inside and out it was as bright as any mirror. I also used to make a very fine sort of powder, in doing which I discovered secret processes beyond any which have yet been found, and on this point, in order to be brief, I will give but one particular, which will astonish good shots of every degree. This is, that when I charged my gun with powder weighing 1/5 of the ball, it carried 200 paces point blank. It is true that the great delight I took in this exercise bid fair to withdraw me from my art and studies, yet in another way it gave me more than it deprived me of, seeing that each time I went out shooting I returned with greatly better health, because the open air was a benefit to my constitution. My natural temperament was melancholy, and while I was taking these amusements my heart leapt up with joy, and I found that I could work better and with far greater mastery than when I spent my whole time in study and manual labour. In this way, my gun, at the end of the game, stood me more in profit than in loss. It was also the cause of my making acquaintance with certain hunters after curiosities, who followed in the track of those Lombard peasants who used to come to Rome to till the vineyards at the proper season. While digging the ground, they frequently turned up antique medals, agates, chrysoprases, cornelians and cameos, also sometimes jewels, as for instance emeralds, sapphires, diamonds and rubies. The peasants used to sell things of this sort to the traders for a mere trifle, and I very often, when I met them, paid the latter several times as many golden crowns as they had given Giulio's for some object. Independently of the profit I made by this traffic, which was at least tenfold, it brought me also into agreeable relations with nearly all the cardinals of Rome. I will only touch upon a few of the most notable and the rarest of these curiosities. There came into my hands, among many other fragments, the head of a dolphin about as big as a good-sized ballot bean. Not only was the style of this head extremely beautiful, but nature had here far surpassed art, for the stone was an emerald of such good colour that the man who bought it from me for tens of crowns sold it again for hundreds after setting it as a finger ring. I will mention another kind of gem. This was a magnificent topaz, and here art equalled nature. It was as large as a big hazelnut, with the head of Minerva in a style of inconceivable beauty. I remember yet another precious stone, different from these. It was a cameo engraved with Hercules binding Cerberus of the triple throat. Such was its beauty and the skill of its workmanship that our great Michelagnolo protested he had never seen anything so wonderful. Among many bronze medals, I obtained one upon which was a head of Jupiter. It was the largest that had ever been seen, the head of the most perfect execution, and it had on the reverse side a very fine design of some little figures in the same style. I might enlarge at great length on this curiosity, but I will refrain, for fear of being prolix. 28. As I have said above, the plague had broken out in Rome. But though I must return a little way upon my steps, I shall not therefore abandon the main path of my history. There arrived in Rome a surgeon of the highest renown, who was called Maestro Jacomo da Carpi. This able man, in the course of his other practice, undertook the most desperate cases of the so-called French disease. In Rome this kind of illness is very partial to the priests, and especially to the richest of them. When, therefore, Maestro Jacomo had made his talents known, he professed to work miracles in the treatment of such cases by means of certain fumigations, but he only undertook a cure after stipulating for his fees, which he reckoned not by tens, but by hundreds of crowns. He was a great connoisseur in the arts of design. Chancing to pass one day before my shop, he saw a lot of drawings which I had laid upon the counter, and among these were several designs for little vases in a capricious style, which I had sketched for my amusement. These vases were in quite a different fashion from any which had been seen up to that date. He was anxious that I should finish one or two of them for him in silver, and this I did with the fullest satisfaction, seeing they exactly suited my own fancy. The clever surgeon paid me very well, and yet the honour which the vases brought me was worth 100 times as much, for the best craftsmen in the goldsmith's trade declared they had never seen anything more beautiful or better executed. No sooner had I finished them than he showed them to the Pope, and the next day following he betook himself away from Rome. He was a man of much learning, who used to discourse wonderfully about medicine. The Pope would fain have had him in his service, but he replied that he would not take service with anybody in the world, and that whoso had need of him might come to seek him out. He was a person of great sagacity, and did wisely to get out of Rome, for not many months afterwards all the patients he had treated grew so ill that they were 100 times worse off than before he came. He would certainly have been murdered if he had stopped. He showed my little vases to several persons of quality, amongst others to the most excellent Duke of Ferrara, and pretended that he had got them from a great lord in Rome, by telling this nobleman that if he wanted to be cured he must give him those 2 vases, and that the lord had answered that they were antique, and besought him to ask for anything else which it might be convenient for him to give, provided only he would leave him those. But according to his own account, Maestro Jacomo made as though he would not undertake the cure, and so he got them. I was told this by Messer Alberto Bendedio in Ferrara, who with great ostentation showed me some earthenware copies he possessed of them. Thereupon I laughed, and as I said nothing, Messer Alberto Bendedio, who was a haughty man, flew into a rage and said, "You are laughing at them, are you? And I tell you that during the last 1000 years there has not been born a man capable of so much as copying them." I then, not caring to deprive them of so eminent a reputation, kept silence, and admired them with mute stupefaction. It was said to me in Rome by many great lords, some of whom were my friends, that the work of which I had been speaking was, in their opinion, of marvellous excellence and genuine antiquity; whereupon, emboldened by their praises, I revealed that I had made them. As they would not believe it, and as I wished to prove that I had spoken truth, I was obliged to bring evidence and to make new drawings of the vases, for my word alone was not enough, inasmuch as Maestro Jacomo had cunningly insisted upon carrying off the old drawings with him. By this little job I earned a fair amount of money. 29. The plague went dragging on for many months, but I had as yet managed to keep it at bay, for though several of my comrades were dead, I survived in health and freedom. Now it chanced one evening that an intimate comrade of mine brought home to supper a Bolognese prostitute named Faustina. She was a very fine woman, but about 30 years of age, and she had with her a little serving girl of 13 or 14. Faustina belonging to my friend, I would not have touched her for all the gold in the world, and though she declared she was madly in love with me, I remained steadfast in my loyalty. But after they had gone to bed, I stole away the little serving girl, who was quite a fresh maid, and woe to her if her mistress had known of it. The result was that I enjoyed a very pleasant night, far more to my satisfaction than if I had passed it with Faustina. I rose upon the hour of breaking fast, and felt tired, for I had travelled many miles that night, and was wanting to take food, when a crushing headache seized me. Several boils appeared on my left arm, together with a carbuncle which showed itself just beyond the palm of the left hand where it joins the wrist. Everybody in the house was in a panic. My friend, the cow and the calf, all fled. Left alone there with my poor little prentice, who refused to abandon me, I felt stifled at the heart and made up my mind for certain I was a dead man. Just then the father of the lad went by, who was physician to the Cardinal Iaccoacci, and lived as member of that prelate's household. The boy called out, "Come, father, and see Benvenuto; he is in bed with some trifling indisposition." Without thinking what my complaint might be, the doctor came up at once, and when he had felt my pulse, he saw and felt what was very contrary to his own wishes. Turning round to his son, he said, "O traitor of a child, you've ruined me! How can I venture now into the cardinal's presence?" His son made answer, "Why, father, this man my master is worth far more than all the cardinals in Rome." Then the doctor turned to me and said, "Since I am here, I will consent to treat you, but of one thing only I warn you, that if you have enjoyed a woman, you are doomed." To this I replied, "I did so this very night." He answered, "With whom, and to what extent?" I said, "Last night, and with a girl in her earliest maturity." Upon this, perceiving that he had spoken foolishly, he made haste to add, "Well, considering the sores are so new and have not yet begun to stink, and that the remedies will be taken in time, you need not be too much afraid, for I have good hopes of curing you." When he had prescribed for me and gone away, a very dear friend of mine called Giovanni Rigogli came in, who fell to commiserating my great suffering and also my desertion by my comrade, and said, "Be of good cheer, my Benvenuto, for I will never leave your side until I see you restored to health." I told him not to come too close, since it was all over with me. only I besought him to be so kind as to take a considerable quantity of crowns, which were lying in a little box near my bed, and when God had thought fit to remove me from this world, to send them to my poor father, writing pleasantly to him, in the way I too had done, so far as that appalling season of the plague permitted. My beloved friend declared that he had no intention whatsoever of leaving me, and that come what might, in life or death, he knew very well what was his duty toward a friend. And so we went on by the help of God, and the admirable remedies which I had used began to work a great improvement, and I soon came well out of that dreadful sickness. The sore was still open, with a plug of lint inside it and a plaster above, when I went out riding on a little wild pony. He was covered with hair 4 fingers long, and was exactly as big as a well-grown bear; indeed, he looked just like a bear. I rode out on him to visit the painter Rosso, who was then living in the country, toward Civitavecchia, at a place of Count Anguillara's called Cervetera. I found my friend, and he was very glad to see me, whereupon I said, "I am come to do to you that which you did to me so many months ago." He burst out laughing, embraced and kissed me, and begged me for the Count's sake to keep quiet. I stayed in that place about a month, with much content and gladness, enjoying good wines and excellent food, and treated with the greatest kindness by the Count. Every day I used to ride out alone along the seashore, where I dismounted and filled my pockets with all sorts of pebbles, snail shells, and sea shells of great rarity and beauty. On the last day, for after this I went there no more, I was attacked by a band of men, who had disguised themselves and disembarked from a Moorish privateer. When they thought that they had run me into a certain passage, where it seemed impossible that I should escape from their hands, I suddenly mounted my pony, resolved to be roasted or boiled alive at the Pass Perilous, seeing I had little hope to evade one or the other of these fates. But, as God willed, my pony, who was the same I have described above, took an incredibly wide jump, and brought me off in safety, for which I heartily thanked God. I told the story to the Count. He ran to arms, but we saw the galleys setting out to sea. The next day following, I went back sound and with good cheer to Rome. 30. The plague had by this time almost died out, so that the survivors, when they met together alive, rejoiced with much delight in one another's company. This led to the formation of a club of painters, sculptors, and goldsmiths, the best that were in Rome, and the founder of it was a sculptor with the name of Michelagnolo. He was a Sienese and a man of great ability, who could hold his own against any other workman in that art; but above all, he was the most amusing comrade and the heartiest good fellow in the universe. Of all the members of the club he was the eldest, and yet the youngest from the strength and vigour of his body. We often came together, at the very least twice a week. I must not omit to mention that our society counted Giulio Romano, the painter, and Gianfrancesco, both of them celebrated pupils of the mighty Raffaello da Urbino. After many and many merry meetings, it seemed good to our worthy president that for the following Sunday we should repair to supper in his house, and that each one of us should be obliged to bring with him his crow. Such was the nickname Michelagnolo gave to women in the club, and that whoso did not bring one should be sconced by paying a supper to the whole company. Those of us who had no familiarity with women of the town were forced to purvey themselves at no small trouble and expense, in order to appear without disgrace at that distinguished feast of artists. I had reckoned upon being well provided with a young woman of considerable beauty, called Pantasilea, who was very much in love with me. But I was obliged to give her up to one of my dearest friends, called Il Berchiaca, who on his side had been, and still was, over head and ears in love with her. This exchange excited a certain amount of lovers' anger, because the lady, seeing I had abandoned her at Bachiaca's first entreaty, imagined that I held in slight esteem the great affection which she bore me. In course of time a very serious incident grew out of this misunderstanding, through her desire to take revenge for the affront I had put upon her, whereof I shall speak hereafter in the proper place. Well then, the hour was drawing nigh when we had to present ourselves before that company of men of genius, each with his own crow, and I was still unprovided, and yet I thought it would be stupid to fail of such a madcap bagatelle, But what particularly weighed upon my mind was that I did not choose to lend the light of my countenance in that illustrious sphere to some miserable plume-plucked scarecrow. All these considerations made me devise a pleasant trick, for the increase of merriment and the diffusion of mirth in our society. Having taken this resolve, I sent for a stripling of 16 years, who lived in the next house to mine. He was the son of a Spanish coppersmith. This young man gave his time to Latin studies, and was very diligent in their pursuit. He bore the name of Diego, had a handsome figure and a complexion of marvellous brilliancy. The outlines of his head and face were far more beautiful than those of the antique Antinous. I had often copied them, gaining thereby much honour from the works in which I used them. The youth had no acquaintances, and was therefore quite unknown, dressed very ill and negligently, all his affections being set upon those wonderful studies of his. After bringing him to my house, I begged him to let me array him in the woman's clothes which I had caused to be laid out. He readily complied, and put them on at once, while I added new beauties to the beauty of his face by the elaborate and studied way in which I dressed his hair. In his ears I placed 2 little rings, set with 2 large and fair pearls. The rings were broken, they only clipped his ears, which looked as though they had been pierced. Afterwards I wreathed his throat with chains of gold and rich jewels, and ornamented his fair hands with rings. Then I took him in a pleasant manner by one ear, and drew him before a great looking-glass. The lad, when he beheld himself, cried out with a burst of enthusiasm, "Heavens! Is that Diego?" I said, "That is Diego, from whom until this day I never asked for any kind of favour, but now I only beseech Diego to do me pleasure in one harmless thing, and it is this: I want him to come in those very clothes to supper with the company of artists whereof he has often heard me speak." The young man, who was honest, virtuous, and wise, checked his enthusiasm, bent his eyes to the ground, and stood for a short while in silence. Then with a sudden move he lifted up his face and said, "With Benvenuto I will go. Now let us start." I wrapped his head in a large kind of napkin, which is called in Rome a summer cloth, and when we reached the place of meeting, the company had already assembled, and everybody came forward to greet me. Michelagnolo had placed himself between Giulio and Giovan Francesco. I lifted the veil from the head of my beauty, and then Michelagnolo, who, as I have already said, was the most humorous and amusing fellow in the world, laid his 2 hands, the one on Giulio's and the other on Gianfrancesco's shoulders, and pulling them with all his force, made them bow down, while he, on his knees upon the floor, cried out for mercy, and called to all the folk in words like these: "Behold ye of what sort are the angels of paradise, for though they are called angels, here shall you see that they are not all of the male gender." Then with a loud voice he added, "Angel beauteous, angel best, save me thou, make thou me blessed." Upon this my charming creature laughed, and lifted the right hand, and gave him a papal benediction, with many pleasant words to boot. So Michelagnolo stood up, and said it was the custom to kiss the feet of the Pope and the cheeks of angels, and having done the latter to Diego, the boy blushed deeply, which immensely enhanced his beauty. When this reception was over, we found the whole room full of sonnets which every man of us had made and sent to Michelagnolo. My lad began to read them, and read them all aloud so gracefully that his infinite charms were heightened beyond the powers of language to describe. Then followed conversation and witty sayings, on which I will not enlarge, for that is not my business. Only one clever word must be mentioned, for it was spoken by that admirable painter Giulio, who, looking round with meaning in his eyes on the bystanders, and fixing them particularly upon the women, turned to Michelagnolo and said, "My dear Michelagnolo, your nickname of Crow very well suits those ladies today, though I vow they are somewhat less fair than crows by the side of one of the most lovely peacocks which fancy could have painted." When the banquet was served and ready, and we were going to sit down to table, Giulio asked leave to be allowed to place us. This being granted, he took the women by the hand and arranged them all upon the inner side, with my fair in the centre. Then he placed all the men on the outside and me in the middle, saying there was no honour too great for my deserts. As a background to the women there was spread an espalier of natural jasmines in full beauty, which set off their charms, and especially Diego's, to such great advantage that words would fail to describe the effect. Then we all of us fell to enjoying the abundance of our host's well-furnished table. The supper was followed by a short concert of delightful music, voices joining in harmony with instruments. And forasmuch as they were singing and playing from the book, my beauty begged to be allowed to sing his part. He performed the music better than almost all the rest, which so astonished the company that Giulio and Michelagnolo dropped their earlier tone of banter, exchanging it for well-weighed terms of sober, heartfelt admiration. After the music was over, a certain Aurelio Ascolano, remarkable for his gift as an improvisatory poet, began to extol the women in choice phrases of exquisite compliment. While he was chanting, the two girls who had my beauty between them never left off chattering. One of them related how she had gone wrong, the other asked mine how it had happened with her, and who were her friends, and how long she had been settled in Rome, and many other questions of the kind. It is true that, if I chose to describe such laughable episodes, I could relate several odd things which then occurred through Pantasilea's jealousy on my account, but, since they form no part of my design, I pass them briefly over. At last the conversation of those loose women vexed my beauty, whom we had christened Pomona for the nonce, and Pomona, wanting to escape from their silly talk, turned restlessly upon her chair, first to one side and then to the other. The female brought by Giulio asked whether she felt indisposed. Pomona answered, yes, she thought she was a month or so with a child. This gave them the opportunity of feeling her body and discovering the real sex of the supposed woman. Thereupon they quickly withdrew their hands and rose from table, uttering such gibing words as are commonly addressed to young men of eminent beauty. The whole room rang with laughter and astonishment, in the midst of which Michelagnolo, assuming a fierce aspect, called out for leave to inflict on me the penance he thought fit. When this was granted, he lifted me aloft amid the clamour of the company, crying, "Long live the gentleman! Long live the gentleman!" and added that this was the punishment I deserved for having played so fine a trick. Thus ended that most agreeable supper party, and each of us returned to his own dwelling at the close of day. End of chapters 27 through 30.
Chapters 31 through 33 of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Morgan Scorpion. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1, translated by John Addington Symonds. Chapters 31 through 33. 31. It would take too long to describe in detail all the many and diverse pieces of work which I executed for a great variety of men. At present I need only say that I devoted myself with sustained diligence and industry to acquiring mastery in the several branches of art which I enumerated a short while back. And so I went on labouring incessantly at all of them. But since no opportunity has presented itself as yet for describing my most notable performances, I shall wait to report them in their proper place before very long. The Sienese sculptor, Michelagnolo, of whom I have recently been speaking, was at that time making the monument of the late Pope Adrian. Giulio Romano went to paint for the Marquis of Mantua. The other members of the club betook themselves in different directions, each to his own business, so that our company of artists was well nigh altogether broken up. About this time there fell into my hands some little Turkish poignards. The handle as well as the blade of these daggers was made of iron, and so too was the sheath. They were engraved by means of iron implements with foliage in the most exquisite Turkish style, very neatly filled in with gold. The sight of them stirred in me a great desire to try my own skill in that branch, so different from the others which I practised, and finding that I succeeded to my satisfaction, I executed several pieces. Mine were far more beautiful and more durable than the Turkish, and this for divers reasons. One was that I cut my grooves much deeper and with wider trenches in the steel, for this is not usual in Turkish work. Another was that the Turkish arabesques are only composed of arum leaves, a few small sunflowers, and although these have a certain grace, they do not yield so lasting a pleasure as the patterns which we use. It is true that in Italy we have several different ways of designing foliage. The Lombards, for example, construct very beautiful patterns by copying the leaves of bryony and ivy in exquisite curves, which are extremely agreeable to the eye. The Tuscans and the Romans make a better choice, because they imitate the leaves of the acanthus, commonly called bear's foot, with its stalks and flowers curling in divers wavy lines. And into these arabesques one may excellently well insert the figures of little birds and different animals, by which the good taste of the artist is displayed. Some hints for creatures of this sort can be observed in nature among the wild flowers, as for instance in snapdragons and some few other plants, which must be combined and developed with the help of fanciful imaginings by clever draftsmen. Such arabesques are called grotesques by the ignorant. They have obtained this name of grotesques among the moderns through being found in certain subterranean caverns in Rome by students of antiquity, which caverns were formerly chambers, hot baths, cabinets for study, halls and apartments of like nature. The curious discovering them in such places, since the level of the ground has gradually been raised while they have remained below, and since in Rome these vaulted rooms are commonly called grottos, it has followed that the word grotesque is applied to the patterns I have mentioned. But this is not the right term for them, inasmuch as the ancients, who delighted in composing monsters out of goats, cows, and horses, called these chimerical hybrids by the name of monsters, and the modern artificers of whom I speak, fashioned from the foliage which they copied monsters of like nature. For these the proper name is therefore monsters, and not grotesques. Well then, I designed patterns of this kind, and filled them in with gold as I have mentioned, and they were far more pleasing to the eye than the Turkish. It chanced at that time that I lighted upon some jars or little antique urns filled with ashes, and among the ashes were some iron rings inlaid with gold, for the ancients also used that art, and in each of the rings was set a tiny cameo of shell. On applying to men of learning, they told me that these rings were worn as amulets by folk desirous of abiding with mind unshaken in any extraordinary circumstance, whether of good or evil fortune. Hereupon, at the request of certain noblemen who were my friends, I undertook to fabricate some trifling rings of this kind, but I made them of refined steel, and after they had been well engraved and inlaid with gold, they produced a very beautiful effect, and sometimes a single ring brought me more than 40 crowns, merely in payment for my labour. It was the custom of that epoch to wear little golden medals, upon which every nobleman or man of quality had some device or fancy of his own engraved, and these were worn in the cap. Of such pieces I made very many, and found them extremely difficult to work. I have already mentioned the admirable craftsman Caradosso, who used to make such ornaments, and as there were more than one figure on each piece, he asked at least 100 gold crowns for his fee. This being so, not however because his prices were so high, but because he worked so slowly, I began to be employed by certain noblemen, for whom, among other things, I made a medal in competition with that great artist, and it had 4 figures, upon which I had expended an infinity of labour. These men of quality, when they compared my piece with that of the famous Caradosso, declared that mine was by far the better executed and more beautiful, and bade me ask what I liked as the reward for my trouble, for since I had given them such perfect satisfaction, they wished to do the like by me. I replied that my greatest reward, and what I most desired, was to have rivalled the masterpieces of so eminent an artist, and that if their lordships thought I had, I acknowledged myself to be most amply rewarded. With this I took my leave, and they immediately sent me such a very liberal present that I was well content. Indeed, there grew in me so great a spirit to do well, that to this event I attributed what will afterwards be related of my progress. 32. I shall be obliged to digress a little from the history of my art, unless I were to omit some annoying incidents which have happened in the course of my troubled career. One of these, which I am about to describe, brought me into the greatest risk of my life. I have already told the story of the Artists' Club, and of the farcical adventures which happened owing to the woman whom I mentioned, Pantasilea, the one who felt for me that false and fulsome love. She was furiously enraged because of the pleasant trick by which I brought Diego to our banquet, and she swore to be revenged on me. How she did so is mixed up with the history of a young man called Luigi Pulci, who had recently come to Rome. He was the son of one of the Pulcis who had been beheaded for incest with his daughter, and the youth possessed extraordinary gifts for poetry together with sound Latin scholarship. He wrote well, was graceful in manners, and of surprising personal beauty. He had just left the service of some bishop, whose name I do not remember, and was thoroughly tainted with a very foul disease. While he was yet a lad and living in Florence, they used in certain places of the city to meet together during the nights of summer on the public streets, and he, ranking among the best of the improvisatori, sang there. His recitations were so admirable that the divine Michael Agnolo Buonarroti, that prince of sculptors and of painters, went, wherever he heard that he would be, with the greatest eagerness and delight to listen to him. There was a man called Piloto, a goldsmith, very able in his art, who together with myself joined Buonarroti upon these occasions. Thus acquaintance sprang up between me and Luigi Pulci, and after the lapse of many years, he came in the miserable plight which I have mentioned, to make himself known to me again in Rome, beseeching me for God's sake to help him. Moved to compassion by his great talents, by the love of my fatherland, and by my own natural tenderness of heart, I took him into my house, and had him medically treated in such wise that, being but a youth, he soon regained his health. While he was still pursuing his cure, he never omitted his studies, and I provided him with books according to the means at my disposal. The result was that Luigi, recognizing the great benefits he had received from me, oftentimes with words and tears returned me thanks, protesting that if God should ever put good fortune in his way, he would recompense me for his kindness. To this I replied that I had not done for him as much as I desired, but only what I could, and that it was the duty of human beings to be mutually serviceable. Only I suggested that he repay the service I had rendered him by doing likewise to someone who might have the same need of him as he had of me. The young man in question began to frequent the court of Rome, where he soon found a situation, and enrolled himself in the suite of a bishop, a man of 80 years, who bore the title of Gurgensis. This bishop had a nephew called Messer Giovanni. He was a nobleman of Venice, and the said Messer Giovanni made a show of marvellous attachment to Luigi Pulci's talents, and under the pretence of these talents, he brought him as familiar to himself as his own flesh blood. Luigi having talked of me and of his great obligations to me with Messer Giovanni, the latter expressed a wish to make my acquaintance. Thus when it came to pass that when I had upon a certain evening invited that woman Pantasilea to supper, and had assembled a company of men of parts who were my friends, just at that moment of our sitting down to table, Messer Giovanni and Luigi Pulci arrived, and after some complimentary speeches they both remained to sup with us. The shameless strumpet, casting her eyes upon the young man's beauty, began at once to lay her nets for him; perceiving which, when the supper had come to an agreeable end, I took Luigi aside, and conjured him, by the benefits he said he owed me, to have nothing whatever to do with her. To this he answered, "Good heavens, Benvenuto, do you then take me for a madman?" I rejoined, "Not for a madman, but for a young fellow;" and I swore to him, by God, "I do not give that woman the least thought, but for your sake I should be sorry if through her you came to break your neck." Upon these words, he vowed and prayed to God that, if ever he but spoke with her, he might upon the moment break his neck. I think the poor lad swore this oath to God with all his heart, for he did break his neck, as I shall presently relate. Messer Giovanni showed signs too evident of loving him in a dishonourable way, for we began to notice that Luigi had new suits of silk and velvet every morning, and it was known that he abandoned himself altogether to bad courses. He neglected his fine talents, and pretended not to see or recognise me, because I had once rebuked him, and told him he was giving his soul to foul vices, which would make him break his neck, as he had vowed. 33. Now Messer Giovanni brought his favourite a very fine black horse, for which he paid 150 crowns. The beast was admirably trained to hand, so that Luigi could go daily to caracole around the lodgings of that prostitute Pantasilea. Though I took notice of this, I paid it no attention, only remarking that all things acted as their nature prompted, and meanwhile I gave my whole mind to my studies. It came to pass one Sunday evening that we were invited to sup together with the Sienese sculptor Michael Agnolo, and the time of the year was summer. Bachiacca, of whom I have already spoken, was present at the party, and he had brought with him his old flame Pantasilea. When we were at table, she sat between me and Bachiacca, but in the very middle of the banquet she rose, and excused herself upon the pretence of a natural need, saying she would speedily return. We meanwhile continued talking very agreeably and supping, but she remained an unaccountably long time absent. It chanced that, keeping my ears open, I thought I heard a sort of subdued tittering in the street below. I had a knife in hand which I was using for my service at the table. The window was so close to where I sat, that, by merely rising, I could see Luigi in the street, together with Pantasilea, and I heard Luigi saying, "Oh, if that devil Benvenuto only saw us, shouldn't we catch it?" And she answered, "Have no fear, only listen to the noise they're making. We are the last thing they're thinking of." At these words, having made them both well out, I leapt from the window and took Luigi by the cape, and certainly I should then have killed him with the knife I had, but that he was riding a white horse, to which he clapped spurs, leaving his cape in my grasp in order to preserve his life. Pantasilea took to her heels in the direction of a neighbouring church. The company at supper rose immediately, and came down, entreating me in a body to refrain from putting myself and them to inconvenience for a strumpet. I told them that I should not have let myself be moved on her account, but that I was bent on punishing the infamous young man, who showed how little he regarded me. Accordingly I would not yield to the remonstrances of those ingenious and worthy men, but took my sword, and went alone toward Preti, the house where we were supping, I should say, stood close to the Castello gate which led to Preti. Walking thus upon the road to Preti, I had not gone far before the sun sank, and I re-entered Rome itself at a slow pace. Night had fallen, darkness had come on, but the gates of Rome were not yet shut. Towards 2 hours after sunset, I walked along Pantasilea's lodging, with the intention, if Luigi Pulci were there, of doing something to the discontent of both. When I heard and saw that no one but a poor servant girl called Canida was in the house, I went to put away my cloak and the scabbard of my sword, and then returned to the house, which stood behind the Banchi on the river Tiber. Just opposite stretched a garden belonging to an innkeeper called Romolo. It was enclosed by a thick hedge of thorns, in which I hid myself, standing upright, and waiting till the woman came back with Luigi. After keeping watch a while there, my friend Bachiacca crept up to me, whether led by his own suspicions or by the advice of others, I cannot say. In a low voice he called out to me, "Gossip," for so we used to name ourselves for fun, and then he prayed me for God's love, using the words which follow, with tears in the tone of his voice: "Dear Gossip, I entreat you not to injure that poor girl. She at least has erred no wise in this matter, no, not at all." When I heard what he was saying, I replied: "If you don't take yourself off now, at this first word I utter, I will bring my sword here down upon your head." Overwhelmed with fright, my poor Gossip was suddenly taken ill with the colic, and withdrew to ease himself apart; indeed, he could not but obey the call. There was such a glorious heaven of stars, which shed good light to see by. All of a sudden I was aware of the noise of many horses; they were coming toward me from one side and the other. It turned out to be Luigi and Pantasilea, attended by a certain Messer Benvegnato of Perugia, who was chamberlain to Pope Clement, and followed by 4 doughty captains of Perugia, with some other valiant soldiers in the flower of youth. Altogether reckoned, there were more than 12 swords. When I understood the matter, and saw not how to fly, I did my best to crouch into the hedge. But the thorns pricked and hurt me, goading me to madness like a bull, and I half resolved to take a leap and hazard my escape. Just then Luigi, with his arm round Pantasilea's neck, was heard crying: "I must kiss you once again, if only to insult that traitor Benvenuto." At that moment, annoyed as I was by the prickles, and irritated by the young man's words, I sprang forth, lifted my sword on high, and shouted at the top of my voice, "You are all dead folk!" My blow descended on the shoulder of Luigi, but the satyrs who doted on him had steeled his person round with coats of mail and such like villainous defences. Still the stroke fell with crushing force. Swerving aside, the sword hit Pantasilea full in nose and mouth. Both she and Luigi grovelled on the ground, while Bachiacca, with his breeches down to heels, screamed out and ran away. Then I turned upon the others boldly with my sword, and those valiant fellows, hearing a sudden commotion in the tavern, thought there was an army coming of 100 men; and though they drew their swords with spirit, yet 2 horses which had taken fright in the tumult cast them into such disorder, that a couple of the best riders were thrown, and the remainder took to flight. I, seeing that the affair was turning out well for me, ran as quickly as I could, and came off with honour from the engagement, not wishing to tempt fortune more than was my duty. During the hurly-burly, some of the soldiers and captains wounded themselves with their own arms, and Messer Benvegnato, the Pope's chamberlain, was kicked and trampled by his mule. One of the servants also, who had drawn his sword, fell down together with his master, and wounded him badly in the hand. Maddened by the pain, he swore louder than all the rest in his Perugian jargon, crying out, "By the body of God, I will take care that Benvegnato teaches Benvenuto how to live." He afterwards commissioned one of the captains who were with him, braver perhaps than the others, but with less aplomb as being but a youth, to seek me out. The fellow came to visit me in the place of my retirement. That was the palace of a great Neapolitan nobleman, who had become acquainted with me in my art, and besides taken a fancy to me because of my physical and mental aptitude for fighting, to which my lord himself was personally well inclined. So then, finding myself made much of, and being precisely in my element, I gave such answer to the captain as I think must have made him earnestly repent of having come to look me up. After a few days, when the wounds of Luigi and the strumpet and the rest were healing, the great Neapolitan nobleman received overtures from Messer Benvegnato, for the prelate's anger had cooled, and had proposed to ratify a peace between me and Luigi and the soldiers, who had personally no quarrel with me, and only wished to make my acquaintance. Accordingly my friend the nobleman replied that he would bring me where they chose to appoint, and that he was very willing to effect a reconciliation. He stipulated that no words should be bandied about on either side, seeing that would be little to their credit. It was enough to go through the form of drinking together and exchanging kisses. He for his part undertook to do the talking, and promised to settle the matter to their honour. This arrangement was carried out. On Thursday evening my protector took me to the house of Messer Benvegnato, where all the soldiers who had been present at that discomfiture were assembled, and already seated at table. My nobleman was attended by 30 brave fellows, all well armed, a circumstance which Messer Benvegnato had not anticipated. When we came into the hall, he walking first, I following, he speak to this effect: "God save you, gentlemen! We have come to see you, I and Benvenuto, whom I love like my own brother, and we are ready to do whatever you propose." Messer Benvegnato, seeing the hall filled with such a crowd of men, called out: "It is only peace, and nothing else we ask of you." Accordingly he promised that the governor of Rome with his catchpoles should give me no trouble. Then we made peace, and I returned to my shop, where I could not stay an hour without that Neapolitan nobleman either coming to see me or sending for me. Meanwhile Luigi Pulci, having recovered from his wound, rode every day upon the black horse which was so well trained to heel and bridle. One day, among others, after it had rained a little, and he was making his horse curvet just before Pantasilea's door, he slipped and fell with the horse upon him. His right leg was broken short off in the thigh, and after a few days he died there in Pantasilea's lodgings, discharging thus the vow he registered so heartily to Heaven. Even so it may be seen that God keeps account of the good and the bad, and gives to each one what he merits. End of chapter 31 through 33.
(34 through 37) of the Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini, Volume 1, translated by John Addington Symonds, Chapter 34-37. Chapter 34. The whole world was now in warfare. Pope Clement had sent to get some troops from Giovanni de' Medici, and when they came, they made such disturbances in Rome, that it was ill living in open shops. On this account I retired to a good snug house behind the Bianchi, where I worked for all the friends I had acquired. Since I produced few things of much importance at that period, I need not waste time in talking about them. I took much pleasure in music and amusements of the kind. On the death of Giovanni de' Medici in Lombardy, the Pope, at the advice of Messer Jacopo Salviati, dismissed the 5 bands he had engaged; and when the Constable of Bourbon knew that there were no troops in Rome, he pushed his army with the utmost energy up to the city. The whole of Rome upon this flew to arms. I happened to be intimate with Alessandro, the son of Piero del Beni, who at that time, when the Colonnesi entered Rome, had requested me to guard his palace. On this more serious occasion, therefore, he prayed me to enlist 50 comrades for the protection of the said house, appointing me as their captain, as I had been when the Colonnesi came. So I collected 50 young men of the highest courage, and we took up our quarters in his palace, with good pay and excellent appointments. Bourbon's army had now arrived before the walls of Rome, and Alessandro begged me to go with him to reconnoitre. So we went with one of the stoutest fellows in our company, and on the way a youth called Cecchino della Casa joined himself to us. On reaching the walls by the Campo Santo we could see that famous army, which was making every effort to enter the town. Upon the ramparts where we took our station several young men were lying killed by the besiegers. The battle raged there desperately, and there was the densest fog imaginable. I turned to Alessandro and said: "Let us go home as soon as we can, for there is nothing to be done here. You see the enemies are mounting and our men are in flight." Alessandro, in a panic, cried: "Would God that we had never come here!" and turned in maddest haste to fly. I took him up somewhat sharply with these words: "Since you have brought me here, I must perform some action worthy of a man"; and directing my arquebuse where I saw the thickest and most serried troop of fighting men, I aimed exactly at one whom I remarked to be higher than the rest. The fog prevented me from being certain whether he was on horseback or on foot. Then I turned to Alessandro and Cecchino, and bade them discharge their arquebuses, showing them how to avoid being hit by the besiegers. When we had fired 2 rounds apiece, I crept cautiously up to the wall, and observing among the enemy a most extraordinary confusion, I discovered afterwards that one of our shots had killed the Constable of Bourbon, and from what I subsequently learned he was the man whom I had first noticed above the heads of the rest. Quitting our position on the ramparts, we crossed the Campo Santo, and entered the city by St. Peter's; then coming out exactly at the church of Santo Agnolo, we got with the greatest difficulty to the great gate of the castle, for the generals Renzo de Chieri and Orazio Baglioni were wounding and slaughtering everybody who abandoned the defence of the walls. By the time we had reached the great gate, part of the foemen had already entered Rome, and we had them in our rear. The castellan had ordered the portcullis to be lowered, in order to do which they cleared a little space, and this enabled us 4 to get inside. On the instant that I entered, the captain, Paulino de' Medici, claimed me as being of the Papal household, and forced me to abandon Alessandro, which I had to do much against my will. I ascended to the keep, and at the same instant Pope Clement came in through the corridors into the castle. He had refused to leave the palace of St. Peter earlier, being unable to believe that his enemies would effect their entrance into Rome. Having got into the castle in this way, I attached myself to certain pieces of artillery, which were under the command of a bombardier called Giuliano Fiorentino. Leaning there against the battlements, the unhappy man could see his poor house being sacked, and his wife and children outraged. Fearing to strike his own folk, he dared not discharge the cannon, and flinging the burning fuse upon the ground, he wept as though his heart would break, and tore his cheeks with both hands. Some of the other bombardiers were behaving in like manner; seeing which, I took one of the matches, and got the assistance of a few men who were not overcome by their emotions. I aimed some swivels and falconets at points where I saw it would be useful, and killed with them a good number of the enemy. Had it not been for this, the troops who poured into Rome that morning, and were marching straight upon the castle, might possibly have entered it with ease, because the artillery was doing them no damage. I went on firing under the eyes of several cardinals and lords, who kept blessing me and giving me the heartiest encouragement. In my enthusiasm I strove to achieve the impossible. Let it suffice that it was I who saved the castle that morning, and brought the other bombardiers back to their duty. I worked the whole of that day; and when the evening came, while the army was marching into Rome through the Trastevere, Pope Clement appointed a great Roman nobleman named Antonio Santacroce to be captain of all the gunners. The first thing that this man did was to come to me, and having greeted me with the utmost kindness, he stationed me with 5 fine pieces of artillery on the highest point of the castle, to which the name of the Angel specially belongs. This circular eminence goes round the castle, and surveys both the Prati and the town of Rome. The captain put under my orders enough men to help in managing my guns, and having seen me paid in advance, he gave me rations of bread and a little wine, and begged me to go forward as I had begun. I was perhaps more inclined by nature to the profession of arms than to the one I had adopted, and took such pleasure in its duties that I discharged them better than those of my own art. Night came, the enemy had entered Rome, and we who were in the castle, especially myself who have always taken pleasure in extraordinary sights, stayed gazing on the indescribable scene of tumult and conflagration in the streets below. People who were anywhere else but where we were could not have formed the least imagination of what it was. I will not, however, set myself to describe that tragedy, but will content myself with continuing the history of my own life, and the circumstances which properly belong to it. 35. During the course of my artillery practice, which I never intermitted through the whole month passed by us beleaguered in the castle, I met with a great many very striking accidents, all of them worthy to be related. But since I do not care to be too prolix, or to exhibit myself outside the sphere of my profession, I will omit the larger part of them, only touching upon those I cannot well neglect, which shall be the fewest in number and the most remarkable. The first which comes to hand is this. Messer Antonio Santacroce had made me come down from the Angel, in order to fire on some houses in the neighbourhood, where certain of our besiegers had been seen to enter. While I was firing, a cannon shot reached me, which hit the angle of a battlement, and carried off enough of it to be the cause why I sustained no injury. The whole mass struck me in the chest and took my breath away. I lay stretched upon the ground like a dead man, and could hear what the bystanders were saying. Among them all, Messer Antonio Santacroce lamented greatly, exclaiming, "Alas! alas! we have lost the best defender that we had." Attracted by the uproar, one of my comrades ran up. He was called Gianfrancesco, and was a bandsman, but was far more naturally given to medicine than to music. On the spot he flew off, crying for a stoup of the very best Greek wine. Then he made a tile red hot, and cast upon it a good handful of wormwood; after which he sprinkled the Greek wine, and when the wormwood was well soaked, he laid it on my breast, just where the bruise was visible to all. Such was the virtue of the wormwood that I immediately regained my scattered faculties. I wanted to begin to speak, but could not, for some stupid soldiers had filled my mouth with earth, imagining that by doing so they were giving me the sacrament; and indeed they were more like to have excommunicated me, since I could with difficulty come to myself again; the earth was doing me more mischief than the blow. However, I escaped that danger, and returned to the rage and fury of the guns, pursuing my work there with all the ability and eagerness that I could summon. Pope Clement, by this, had sent to demand assistance from the Duke of Urbino, who was with the troops of Venice. He commissioned the envoy to tell his Excellency that the castle of Sant' Angelo would send up every evening 3 beacons from its summit, accompanied by 3 discharges of the cannon thrice repeated, and that so long as this signal was continued, he might take for granted that the castle had not yielded. I was charged with lighting the beacons and firing the guns for this purpose, and all the while I pointed my artillery by day upon the places where mischief could be done. The Pope in consequence began to regard me with still greater favour, because he saw that I discharged my functions as intelligently as the task demanded. Aid from the Duke of Urbino never came, on which, as it is not my business, I will make no further comment. 36. While I was at work on that diabolical task of mine, there came from time to watch me some of the cardinals who were invested in the castle, and most frequently the Cardinal of Ravenna and the Cardinal de' Gaddi. I often told them not to show themselves, since their nasty red caps gave a fair mark to our enemies. From the neighbouring buildings, such as the Torre de' Bini, we ran great peril when they were there, and at last I had them locked off, and gained thereby their deep ill will. I frequently received visits also from the General, Orazio Baglioni, who was very well affected toward me. One day, while he was talking with me, he noticed something going forward in a drinking place outside the Porta del Castello, which bore the name of Bacchanello. This tavern had for sign a sun painted between two windows, of a bright red colour. The windows being closed, Signor Orazio concluded that a band of soldiers were carousing at table just between them and behind the sun. So he said to me: "Benvenuto, if you think that you could hit that wall an ell's breadth from the sun with your demi cannon here, I believe you would be doing a good stroke of business, for there is a great commotion there, and men of much importance must probably be inside the house." I answered that I felt quite capable of hitting the sun in its centre, but that a barrel full of stones, which was standing close to the muzzle of the gun, might be knocked down by the shock of the discharge and the blast of the artillery. He rejoined: "Don't waste time, Benvenuto. In the first place, it is not possible, where it is standing, that the cannon's blast should bring it down; and even if it were to fall, and the Pope himself was underneath, the mischief would not be so great as you imagine. Fire, then, only fire." Taking no more thought about it, I struck the sun in the centre, exactly as I said I should. The cask was dislodged as I predicted, and fell precisely between Cardinal Farnese and Messer Jacopo Salviati. It might very well have dashed out the brains of both of them, except that just at that very moment Farnese was reproaching Salviati with having caused the sack of Rome, and while they stood apart from one another to exchange opprobrious remarks, my gabion fell without destroying them. When he heard the uproar in the court below, good Signor Orazio dashed off in a hurry, and I, thrusting my neck forward where the cask had fallen, heard some people saying, "It would not be a bad job to kill that gunner." Upon this I turned two falconets toward the staircase, with mind resolved to let blaze on the first man who attempted to come up. The household of Cardinal Farnese must have received orders to go and do me some injury; accordingly I prepared to receive them, with a lighted match in hand. Recognizing some who were approaching, I called out: "You lazy lubbers, if you don't pack off from there, and if but a man's child among you dares to touch the staircase, I've got two cannon loaded, which will blow you into powder. Go and tell the Cardinal that I was acting at the order of superior officers, and that what we have done and are doing is in defence of them priests, and not to hurt them." They made away, and then came Signor Orazio Baglioni running. I bade him stand back, else I'd murder him, for I knew very well who he was. He drew back a little, not without a certain show of fear, and called out: "Benvenuto, I am your friend." To this I answered: "Sir, come up, but come alone, and then come as you like." The General, who was a man of mighty pride, stood still a moment, and then said angrily: "I've a good mind not to come up again, and to do quite the opposite of that which I intended toward you." I replied that just as I was put there to defend my neighbours, I was equally well able to defend myself too. He said that he was coming alone, and when he arrived at the top of the stairs, his features were more discomposed than I thought reasonable. So I kept my hand upon my sword, and stood eyeing him askance. Upon this he began to laugh, and the colour coming back into his face, he said to me with the most pleasant manner: "Friend Benvenuto, I bear you as great love as I have it in my heart to give, and in God's good time I will render you proof of this. Would to God that you had killed those two rascals, for one of them is the cause of all this trouble, and the day perchance will come when the other will be found the cause of something even worse." He then begged me, if I should be asked, not to say that he was with me when I fired the gun, and for the rest bade me be of good cheer. The commotion which the affair made was enormous, and lasted a long while. However, I will not enlarge upon it further, only adding that I was within an inch of revenging my father on Messer Jacopo Salviati, who had grievously injured him, according to my father's complaints. As it was, unwittingly I gave the fellow a great fright. Of Farnese I shall say nothing here, because it will appear in its proper place how well it would have been if I had killed him. 37. I pursued my business of artilleryman, and every day performed some extraordinary feat, whereby the credit and the favour I acquired with the Pope was something indescribable. There never passed a day but what I killed one or another of our enemies in the besieging army. On one occasion the Pope was walking around the circular keep, when he observed a Spanish colonel in the Prati. He recognized the man by certain indications, seeing that this officer had formerly been in his service, and while he fixed his eyes on him, he kept talking about him. I, above by the angel, knew nothing of this, but spied a fellow down there, busying himself about the trenches with a javelin in his hand. He was dressed entirely in rose colour, and so, studying the worst that I could do against him, I selected a gerfalcon which I had at hand. It is a piece of ordnance larger and longer than a swivel, and about the size of a demi-culverin. This I emptied, and loaded it again with a good charge of fine powder mixed with the coarser sort. Then I aimed it exactly at the man in red, elevating prodigiously, because a piece of that calibre could hardly be expected to carry true at such a distance. I fired, and hit my man exactly in the middle. He had trussed his sword in front, for swagger, after a way those Spaniards have, and my ball when it struck him broke upon the blade, and one could see the fellow cut in two fair halves. The Pope, who was expecting nothing of this kind, derived great pleasure and amazement from the sight, both because it seemed to him impossible that one should aim and hit the mark at such a distance, and also because the man was cut in two, and he could not comprehend how this should happen. He sent for me, and asked about it. I explained all the devices I had used in firing, but told him that why the man was cut in two halves neither he nor I could know. Upon my bended knees I then besought him to give me the pardon of his blessing for that homicide, and for all the others I had committed in the castle in the service of the Church. Thereat the Pope, raising his hand, and making a large open sign of the cross upon my face, told me that he blessed me, and that he gave me pardon for all murders I had ever perpetrated, or should ever perpetrate, in the service of the Apostolic Church. When I felt him I went aloft, and never stayed from firing to the utmost of my power, and few were the shots of mine that missed their mark. My drawing, and my fine studies in my craft, and my charming art of music, all were swallowed up in the din of that artillery; and if I were to relate in detail all the splendid things I did in that infernal work of cruelty, I should make the world stand by and wonder. But not to be too prolix, I will pass over them. Only I must tell a few of the most remarkable, which are, as it were, forced in upon me. To begin, then, pondering day and night what I could render for my own part in defence of Holy Church, and having noticed that the enemy changed guard and marched past the great gate of Santo Spirito, which was within a reasonable range, I thereupon directed my attention to that spot; but having to shoot sideways, I could not do the damage that I wished, although I killed a fair percentage every day. This induced our adversaries, when they saw their passage covered by my guns, to load the roof of a certain house one night with 30 gabions, which obstructed the view I formerly enjoyed. Taking better thought than I had done of the whole situation, I now turned all my 5 pieces of artillery directly on the gabions, and waited till the evening hour, when they changed guard. Our enemies, thinking they were safe, came on at greater ease and in a closer body than usual, whereupon I set fire to my blowpipes. Not merely did I dash to pieces the gabions which stood in my way, but what was better, by that one blast I slaughtered more than 30 men. In consequence of this manoeuvre, which I repeated twice, the soldiers were thrown into such disorder, that being, moreover, encumbered with the spoils of that great sack, and some of them desirous of enjoying the fruits of their labour, they oftentimes showed a mind to mutiny and take themselves away from Rome. However, after coming to terms with their valiant captain, Gian d'Urbino, they were ultimately compelled, at their excessive inconvenience, to take another road when they changed guard. It cost them 3 miles of march, whereas before they had but half a mile. Having achieved this feat, I was entreated with prodigious favours by all the men of quality who were invested in the castle. This incident was so important that I thought it well to relate it, before finishing the history of things outside my art, which is the real object of my writing; forsooth, if I wanted to ornament my biography with such matters, I should have far too much to tell. There is only one more circumstance which, now that the occasion offers, I propose to record. Chapters 34 through 37.